Ghosts are a fascinating phenomenon. In our world, hauntings are considered anecdotal. However, in the Elder Scrolls universe, they're a fairly common occurrence. Not something you'd expect on a daily basis if you occupied this world, but something certainly accepted by many to be real, and proven to us as the player, not only serving as proof of life after death, but also as an extension of the fact that is the separation of the soul from the body. Is that an oversimplification? Maybe. But what I'm getting at is, unlike the real world, in the Elder Scrolls games there is a clear definition for what a ghost actually is. And quite predictably, you might argue, they are the spirits of the deceased, who have unfulfilled pressing matters to attend to on the mortal plane, or are otherwise bound to the world of the living through external factors, such as necromancy. However, today's video isn't on all ghosts in the Elder Scrolls universe, but rather, just one. For when travelling by the roads of Skyrim at night, there is a good chance of encountering a distinct spectre, one that takes the shape of a headless warrior riding a ghostly horse. This figure is interesting. Not only is it fairly straightforward to encounter, it's also a fairly well-known Easter egg, and there is a popular fan theory around it. So join me on a nice torchlit mooch through Skyrim as we tackle the Headless Horseman. To meet this apparition in particular, we'll need to specifically explore the roads of Skyrim at night, between the hours of 10 PM and 4 AM. He can spawn anywhere randomly in the world and takes the roads to a fixed destination, and that destination doesn't change. However, for reasons you'll come to understand when we get to it, that does mean he's most reliably going to show up in Whiterun Hold. And for me, that happened to be the road south of the hamlet of Rorikstead. Even though I was kind of searching for him, he still caught me off guard because I was only gathering B-roll when he decided to interrupt my shot. As you could predict, the Headless Horseman is headless and riding a horse, wearing steel plate armour, and he performs no real actions, nor does he really acknowledge your presence. He simply keeps riding, occasionally stopping to allow you to get a closer look. Upon encountering this apparition, we will receive no objective. However, we can follow the horseman, which isn't tricky as the horses of Skyrim aren't particularly speedy, but for how long we'll need to do this does depend where in the world we actually find him. As like I said, his intended destination does not change. Random enemy encounters may still attack you while following the horseman. They may indeed attack him, but he cannot be harmed, so it's not a big deal. As for the destination he leads us to, he takes us to an ancient Nordic burial site known as Hamvir's Rest, situated on the south side of a mountain range separating the hold of Whiterun from Hjalmarch to the north. Upon arrival, the horseman will stop and will be left to face a small handful of skeletons and a draugr. In other words, nothing too difficult. And upon defeating our undead foes, at least for me, the Headless Horseman will be gone, leaving us to crack open this master-locked chest in peace, which contains random assortments of stuff. But there are a few things of note at this burial site. Aside from your ordinary graves, which you'd kind of expect from a place such as this, there are a couple undisturbed sarcophagi locked away behind metal bars. The one on the right doesn't really have much going on for it. However, the one on the left is accompanied by a helmet, an axe, and a human skull. An inefficient haircut at the best of times. I'm led to believe the helmet that spawns is entirely random and dependent on your level, and the axe accompanied by the human skull is interesting considering the entity that brought us here, and that kind of allows us to revert our attention to the entity itself. Obviously, there's the Easter egg angle. In European folklore, the mythical archetype of a headless horseman has been depicted since around the Middle Ages, typically viewed as a rider on horseback who, as expected, has no head. Irish folklore has the Dullahan depicted as a headless rider on a black horse, and sometimes as a coachman carrying his own decapitated head. However, that name appears wildly applied to various legends, and its place in its respective folklore is debated. In Scottish folklore, an encounter with a headless rider is said to be regarded as an omen that a death will soon befall the family of the witness. The Welsh have a series of stories pertaining to a headless rider, including that of a headless woman who rides a headless horse, and the story of a village called Llanimadwy. I know I probably pronounced that wrong, but it's better to try and fail than not bother. And I did Google it, I just can't get my lumbering tongue around it, so to speak. Now, it said this small community in southeast Gwynedd was haunted by a headless rider of some description. However, the hauntings ceased upon the supposed discovery of a grave belonging to the illegitimate child of the local lord, making this particular headless horseman something of a messenger. As for the English, well, apparently Dartmoor in Devon is known for its headless horseman hauntings, which is ideal because I have footage from there. There's the story of the Green Knight in Arthurian legend who happens to be a knight/horseman who gets decapitated and somehow lives, but for the most part with the English, encounters with a headless horseman are often tarred with disappointment upon realising you have nowhere to put that traffic cone you found by the side of the road. As for German folklore, headless horsemen are believed to be revenant spirits wandering the earth atoning for their own sins, perhaps by doing good deeds or punishing those deemed to be wicked. Now, arguably I've gone too vague to do any of these cultural tales much justice, but the point I'm trying to make is this lone headless rider is quite obviously an Easter egg. However, not directly to any European folk tale regarding a man on a horse with no head, but rather from the material that popularised this archetype, the legend of Sleepy Hollow, a short story written by Washington Irving, which was published as part of the broader work known as the Sketchbook in 1820. As the title suggests, the story is set in a village named Sleepy Hollow in the state of New York in the United States towards the end of the 18th century, and follows a fellow named Ichabod Crane who intends to win the affection of the daughter of a local farmer. And long story short, this is met with competition, and the man he's competing with effectively attempts to scare him off, telling the tale of a Hessian trooper decapitated during the American Revolution, buried in the local churchyard, that rises from his grave to search for his missing head. And to avoid going into too much depth, one night, Crane encounters what he believes to be the Headless Horseman, who proceeds to chase Crane and knock him off his horse. After that, he disappears, leaving the fate of this story's protagonist and the nature of the Headless Horseman open to interpretation. Though the legend of Sleepy Hollow is inspired by European folk tales of a Headless Horseman, it itself is perhaps the most popular story that contains such an entity, and considering Irving's status as one of the first American writers to garner international acclaim, specifically in Europe, I think it's fair to say that any Headless Horseman Easter eggs are more tilted towards him and his story than any other tale. So now that we know what this is likely a reference to, is there an in-universe explanation for this ghost of a headless rider that we can find roaming the roads of the province of Skyrim at night? Well, the short answer is unfortunately no. There is nothing that directly explains this particular ghost, which I personally find to be odd. He's a transparent glowing headless man riding a transparent glowing horse. He's followed by a ghostly trail and travels along main roads. Yes, he may travel in the dead of night between 10 PM and 4 AM, but even with that in mind, when most of the world is asleep, he's hardly subtle. Surely somebody would make the direct mention of a spectre with no head riding a horse throughout the province of Skyrim at night because, well, it does stand out. However, there's nothing that adds more flesh to the Headless Horseman's existence within the Elder Scrolls universe. No books mentioning him, no dialogue mentioning him, not even in casual passing. Even the appearance of the ghost itself is vague. A headless man on horseback, sure, but of course, thanks to missing a head, he has no face and wears bland old steel plate armour, and has a rather unimpressive axe. So you have to lean towards fan theories to get anything more out of his existence as an Easter egg. I've seen a theory that he's the Stormcloak rebel who gets made shorter at the start of the game, but if that were the case, why wouldn't the Headless Horseman wear Stormcloak armour? Another obvious idea is because he leads you to Hamvir's Rest. Maybe he's Hamvir, whoever that happens to actually be. There's nothing hugely special about this burial site. You just fight a few skeletons and a Draugr, all of whom have their heads. And you would have thought, in order for the ghost of a Headless Horseman to exist, said individual that this once was must have died due to decapitation. Not that the amount of enemies that spawn here correlate directly to the number of graves and sarcophagi in total there are. They don't. But surely the horseman has some connection to this site, otherwise why keep coming here? So, not ready to let go of this, I looked into the name Hamvir to see where it led me. And as it turns out, there are two known characters in the Elder Scrolls universe named Hamvir. The Nord slaver in the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind, whom I have no doubt nobody would care to bury, and the Nord healer who lives in Dragonbridge Skyrim in the Elder Scrolls Online. And he's only involved in a little quest in which he's looking for somebody to guide him through a cave so he can seek a cure for his sister who was attacked by a chorus? I don't know, I've never heard the name of these things said out loud. All I know is I don't enjoy these creatures' company. Anyway, I doubt either Hamvir is the one that's resting here presently, as I'm sure there are many unseen individuals who also happen to be named Hamvir. So I guess what I'm saying is, in a very long-winded way, the name Hamvir appears to be a dead end, which is somewhat poetic when you think about it. However, the horseman's connection to this site is obvious, so he could very well be this elusive and dead, presumably, Hamvir. I just highly doubt that is any character we're able to meet in life. Some might argue that explanation is quite boring, and I agree. So let's pivot to the next theory, which is arguably a favourite among players. If you'll recall me saying just a little bit earlier, I stated there was no direct information to be found regarding the Headless Horseman. And that is true, there's nothing that addresses the Headless Horseman like so, but what if there's some indirect hint? For those few unfamiliar, to understand what I mean, I think we're going to need to employ the aid of a bard.
This is a local favorite and one of the first songs I ever learned. Ragnar the Red. Oh, there once was a hero named Ragnar the Red who came riding to Whiterun from old Rorikstead. And the braggart did swagger and brandish his blade as he told of bold battles and gold he had made. But then he went quiet, did Ragnar the Red, when he met the shield maiden Matilda, who said, "Oh, you talk and you lie and you drink all our mead. Now I think it's high time that you lie down and bleed." And so then came clashing and slashing of steel as the brave lass Matilda charged in full of zeal. And the braggart named Ragnar was boastful no more when his ugly red head rolled around on the floor.
Players noticed a correlation between this Nordic song about a hero named Ragnar the Red and their experiences with the Headless Horseman. So let's break it down verse by verse. And no, I am not singing. I am willing to make a fool of myself, any which direction, but you will never hear me singing.
Oh, there once was a hero named Ragnar the Red who came riding to Whiterun from old Rorikstead.
This opening verse is an interesting one, and before we move on to the next verse you'll see why. It appears to simply state where Ragnar the Red came from and where he went. He came from old Rorikstead and arrived at Whiterun. The word riding implies he was on horseback, so you could argue he was a horseman. Now, interestingly, the location of Hamvir's Rest is situated between Whiterun and Rorikstead. Now, it is important to note here the Headless Horseman can be encountered throughout the game's world map. However, with his final destination being within Whiterun Hold, and the positioning of Hamvir's Rest considering the horseman only uses the province's roads, he has to use a portion of that route, meaning the route between Rorikstead and Whiterun is the most likely place where you will encounter this ghostly figure. So that gives him a loose and arguably incredibly weak relation to this song, otherwise known as a coincidence. Now, as a bit of a side note, this verse is made interesting by the fact that Rorikstead isn't that old a village, with its founder, Rorik, still drawing breath. We can even ask him if the village was named after him, to which he responds,
"Yes, that's right. Look around you. Most of the lands you see are mine. Most of this I purchased while my comrades were fighting in the south, helping the Empire against the Aldmeri Dominion. Back then, nothing would grow here, and so the land was worthless. Now, thanks to the hard work and the gods' blessings, our farms prosper."
What Rorik is basically telling us is this village isn't very old at all. He founded it during the time of the Great War between the Empire and the Aldmeri Dominion, a conflict that occurred between the 171st and 175th years of the Fourth Era. The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim takes place in the 201st year of the Fourth Era. So what this means is, provided Rorik isn't full of shit, Rorikstead at most is 30 years old. However, judging by the fame of the Ragnar the Red song to the point where even carriage drivers will be muttering it as they take you places, and Bard's reverence of it indicates it's something of a classic, I'd argue there's a better than good chance the song of Ragnar the Red predates the foundation of this Rorikstead, which is why the word old is so important. So is this song bound to a timeline that doesn't suit it? Or is Rorik of Rorikstead not quite telling the whole truth? And that's a question answered by the holdings of Jarl Gjarlan, a book found on Farengar's desk in Dragon's Reach, an ancient survey document belonging to the Jarl of Whiterun that, according to Farengar, dates back to the First Era, if not earlier. So this means by the 201st year of the Fourth Era, this book is at least 1,530 years old, and is probably older than that. And what makes that bollocks at all relevant is the mention of a Roriksteading, described as a small farmstead in the Western Plains, which wouldn't be terribly far from modern Rorikstead. So a version of Rorikstead came to exist before the Rorikstead we see before us in Skyrim, even if there are a couple more oddities that would be relevant to a different topic. However, for the purpose of this one, the mention of Rorikstead doesn't necessarily narrow down the timeline in which the events of the story of Ragnar the Red occur. So with that said, let's move on.
And the braggart did swagger and brandish his blade as he told of bold battles and gold he had made.
It appears the word hero from the previous verse is used more in jest, as this second verse reveals him to be a boastful oaf of a less than humble disposition who likes nothing more than to brag. This suits the potential backstory for a Headless Horseman according to the folklore we went over a bit earlier, specifically the German folklore regarding the notion of Headless Horsemen being a form of revenant spirit, forced to wander the earth until they'd atoned for their sins. And though puffing yourself up does sound like a bit of a harsh reason for such a horrible post-fate, in the Christian world of old it was considered, by proxy admittedly, a sinful endeavour, on account of stirring up quarrels, and arrogance isn't much appreciated these days either. Self-aggrandizing is also often viewed as a sin in its own right, and within Christian teachings, pride is the first of the 7 deadly sins, along with greed, wrath, envy, lust, gluttony, and sloth. And though I'm not entirely sure what Sid did, I'm sure he had it coming.
But then he went quiet, did Ragnar the Red, when he met the shield maiden Matilda, who said, "Oh, you talk and you lie and you drink all our mead. Now I think it's high time that you lie down and bleed."
Not only does this re-emphasise Ragnar the Red's self-pride and arrogance, but it also implies he's gluttonous and greedy. Away from real-world religious parallels to draw, we also learn that Ragnar the Red is not awfully well liked, and should this song actually be documenting an event that happened within the Elder Scrolls universe, I doubt the lyrics of this song are explicitly going over why Matilda decides that it's time for Ragnar the Red to die. I'm sure there's more to it than his overindulgence in mead, his clear one true love of gold, his fibs and his self-importance.
And so then came clashing and slashing of steel as the brave lass Matilda charged in full of zeal. And the braggart named Ragnar was boastful no more when his ugly red head rolled around on the floor.
So, what we can gather from this song/story is not only did this shield maiden Matilda decide Ragnar needed to die, she decapitated him, which would certainly explain the headlessness if indeed he became the Headless Horseman. So to summarise what we know about Ragnar the Red, who was a warrior of some description, who was boastful, greedy and gluttonous, who had a loose relationship with the truth, and was killed via decapitation for reasons likely as between the lines as on them. Considering the real-world mythology parallels at play, assuming they're at all intentional, there is a fairly compelling case to be made for Ragnar the Red perhaps being the identity of the Horseman. But there's just one minor hurdle to overcome. Did he even exist? Or was he simply made up for the purpose of this bard's song? That is certainly not a question I can provide a firm answer to. However, were it fictional within the context of the Elder Scrolls universe, it would be a touch out of place. There are 5 bardic performances that can be heard throughout the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, and the 4 that aren't Ragnar the Red all have some real basis. The Age of Aggression and Age of Oppression are both contemporary songs regarding the Civil War. They're variations of each other depending on which side you're on. The Dragonborn Comes is about the rise of you, the Dragonborn, and The Tale of Tongues is accessible upon completing the game's main storyline and documents the defeat of Alduin. So while an entirely fictional based song would certainly balance out the portfolio a bit, Ragnar the Red stands a pretty good chance at having been a real person in Tamriel's history. To beef out my point, perhaps it's worth addressing the nature of a bard in our own world. In Celtic cultures, bards were storytellers, musicians, and oral historians, often viewed as all 3 at the same time, using music to tell stories, recounting historical events. And courtesy of the existence of the Bard's College in Solitude, we know that's how the bards are intended to be viewed in Skyrim as well. So though we lack the conclusive confidence to say Ragnar the Red did exist in this universe, it certainly isn't an ill-founded assumption. So, with that in mind, is he the Headless Horseman? I can understand why you'd come to that conclusion, however there are a few problems that can't go unaddressed. For instance, he's neither riding to Whiterun, nor is he coming from Rorikstead. Rather, he's riding to Hamvir's Rest in Whiterun Hold from quite literally anywhere on the map. Furthermore, the song mentions him brandishing a blade, which isn't terminology typically used for somebody who wields an axe, like the Headless Horseman. Third, in this theory, what would Ragnar the Red's connection to Hamvir's Rest be? If guards are singing about him, there's a chance that if he was real, he was a feigned hero. I find it hard to believe he'd be tossed into a burial site dedicated to somebody else. There's an element of the popular Ragnar the Red theory that exists in absence of a better explanation. For instance, if he's connected to Hamvir's Rest, surely it makes more sense for the Headless Horseman to be Hamvir. I like the existence of the Ragnar the Red theory personally, but I'm undecided on it. It's important to remember the Headless Horseman exists primarily as an Easter egg, and Easter eggs aren't necessarily explained. You encounter them, realise what they're referencing, and appreciate the reference or don't, and then you move on. But if we approach that thought from another angle, it is hard to deny that a Headless Horseman roaming Skyrim at night does capture the mind. And though the theory of Ragnar the Red from a bard's song being the identity of this Headless Horseman hardly sits flush, it is probably the best theory that fans have come up with. And that's because it makes more sense than it being a random character called Dave or something. So I find myself in a position of being able to view this from both sides. I understand why people believe this theory, and I also understand those who view it as a far-fetched notion. Do you know how many people get decapitated in Skyrim alone? Therefore, this video is a tricky one to conclude. All I can say is I'm sorry I don't have a clear answer for you. However, I would love to know your thoughts in the comments section. Let me know, do you think the Headless Horseman is Ragnar the Red? Do you think it's a random bloke we never see nor hear called Hamvir? Or do you picture this ominous rider ghost being a random inconsequential bloke in life named Steve or Sid? Or are you of the 100% logical sort who believes Bethesda never intended for this to be a question that was asked, much less answered? Regardless, I think today's ramble has gone on for quite long enough. I wish to thank you all for watching. I really hope that you've enjoyed it. I decided to do a few more of these after the Butcher video did okay. People seem to like it in the comment section, and I'm more than happy to have something to do. And I enjoy Skyrim, I enjoy the lore of the Elder Scrolls, even if, for the most part, my understanding of it is pitiful, to say the least. And I've always wanted to make some form of substantial content on these games. Understanding that video essays is a tricky market to get into, I thought I'd lean into my strengths as presented through the Red Dead and Grand Theft Auto content and whatever, and just go for it. Hopefully, these videos hit the bar of acceptability, but that's for you to decide and not me. Nevertheless, I'm going to go and hibernate in the corner now. Thank you all for watching. I really hope that you've enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to go ahead and leave a like, maybe subscribe, share the channel with your friends, and if you do decide to subscribe, which I massively appreciate by the way, make sure to hit that notification bell so that YouTube actually notifies you when I publish something, and that would make me smile massively. If you wish to follow me on some social media, there will be links in the description. I barely post anything related to my YouTube content over there, but there are some dog pictures, which I highly recommend. That said, I understand that Elder Scrolls fans are more into lizards and cats, aren't they? No matter, with any luck I'll be seeing you all very soon with another video at some point, but until next time, please take care and goodbye.